Hello and welcome. My name is Emily Reish. I'm a design manager at the Center for Academic Innovation. Thank you for joining us today for the Michigan Online Visionary Educators event. The MOVE series is hosted by the Center for Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan. An important part of our mission is to create a more inclusive and global learning community. We believe an informed, peaceful, and equitable society is dependent on learners everywhere adopting a learning lifestyle. This monthly series features experts sharing insights, tools, and discussions on issues relevant to the lives of people around the world. Many of the speakers may be familiar to you, as they are the faculty behind some of our most successful and innovative learning experiences available through Michigan Online. For information on our upcoming MOVE series events, be sure to check out the schedule at online.umich.edu/move. We invite you to submit questions for our panelists in the Q&A section. You can also upvote the questions that are most interesting to you. Our panelists will do their best to answer as many questions as they can, but given our limited time, we ask that you keep your questions related to accessibility strategies. We've received some wonderful questions requesting career advice, broadband infrastructure, or computer programming languages, and those won't be a part of what we cover today. Additionally, we want you to know that our event will be recorded and it will be made available through Michigan Online. Today, I'm joined by Colleen Van Lent, lecturer in information at the University of Michigan School of Information, and Kristin Fontichiaro, clinical associate professor in information at the University of Michigan School of Information. They are going to discuss accessibility in the digital world. Colleen and Kristin, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Emily. So as Colleen boots up our slide deck, we want to say how glad we are to see folks from such a diversity of perspectives. As we were thinking about this session, we really were thinking about the two groups that we've worked with the most, which is other educators and also folks in the library community, because those are the two professions that really had to convert their entire way of doing business in many cases. And we want to take a moment to acknowledge that for all of you, both in those fields and beyond, who have had to transform and convert their practices on a dime, you have accomplished so much. One of the things I notice when I work, I primarily work with libraries and librarians, is that there's a sense of not having accomplished a lot, and yet anyone who's not in your workplace can see immediately how much work that you have done. So congratulations on all you have accomplished in what we might call this sort of emergency remote period. And you're going to find as we go through this session, which is a little more generally focused than technically focused, that we're going to focus on sort of some basics about how we make those platforms and the tools we use more accessible to folks. We'll have some technical resources at the end. But we realized that many of you have already implicitly made accessibility adjustments. You just may not have labeled them that way. So, but even Colleen and I, as we talked about these the ways in which we've navigated the world, we realized that we had strategies that we had never taken the time to think of before. So if we're talking on a general level and you have very specific technical questions, we see other technical people who can answer those for one another in the chat, and we hope you'll take advantage to doing so. In fact, one of the accessibility things we want you to think about is that you should notice in your Zoom window that if you go between the slide and the image, you should see a little double line, and you can use that to resize. So if you need to see more of our faces and less of the slides, you can do that. Or if you like to see all the slides and none of us, I haven't had a haircut since before the pandemic. You're welcome to size in another direction.
Right.
All right, over to you, Colleen.
Yeah, I was pop in too. Just, wanted to welcome everyone and really talk about, when we were talking with, the Center for Academic Innovations, we're like, wouldn't it be nice if we could share some of the things that we've learned? And also, I think the chat today would be a wonderful place for people to talk about things that they learned. Because every once in a while you're like, wait, you can do what? You can do what, like I've learned so much from Kristin just talking about things like that. And I was like, I wish somebody had told me that earlier. And I think a lot of people have a wealth of information. And it can be really big. Like there's so many different things to talk about. We're like, all right, how can we kind of break this down? And at first we weren't going to do slides, right? We're like, it's going to be more like a fireside chat. And we're like, no, if we're going to talk about accessibility, right? If we're really going to do what we said we should do, sometimes we're going to have things that don't look what some people think is as attractive, right? And we're like, oh, let's remind people that you can absolutely make the slides really small if you want to. They're just kind of a placeholder. Occasionally there's something inspirational in there. But even these little things, whenever you sit down and you start talking with someone about accessibility, I think you start to go, oh, why was I doing that? So we're kind of focusing on three main areas today, but then based on some of the questions we did get, I wanted to add a fourth section that will be more towards the end with some technical concepts, right? So today we really want to talk about kind of video conferencing. We talk about Google Drive, but we want, there to be, I also include the Microsoft Suite in there, but basically when you're making presentation materials, and then also some social media. So we wanted to start off with a, kind of feel free in the chat to add things about like what hacks have helped you this year, right? Okay. Kristin, did you have specifics you were thinking about, like things, you were the one who told me about turning the camera off or live transition. We would love to hear from all of you.
Right. So for example, I learned to ask in advance if it could be a phone call or could it be an audio only call when I realized all I was doing was talking to a screen all day. And if we moved to audio only, I could take the call through my phone, and then I could clean my home office, AKA my house, or go for a walk and still get the work done, but also get some different kinds of stimulation to keep my brain going. So we would love to know other things that you have done that have helped make your life easier during this pandemic.
Yeah, I went to use my son's computer for a conference, and the whole conference, I'm like, I look so good today. Why do I look so, like, I look way better than I usually look. And that's how I learned that, Zoom has something called like touch up, like didn't even know. So now I'm back on my own computer and I look like I normally look, but it's those little things like that you're like, oh, I didn't know about that. So before we're going to start off a Zoom, like a poll in just a second, but Kristin, how about you talk about what you and I mean when we talk about accessibility and universal design?
Yeah, so those of you who come from an education background might be familiar with the idea of universal design for learning. And it comes off this bigger idea of universal design, which is that whether you are creating slide decks or you're creating software or you're creating architecture or home decor, you want to think about creating things that are accessible in lots of ways that that support a lot of ranges of abilities or challenges and other characteristics. So if you think about things like curb cuts really served the, they started by really being something that folks in wheelchairs could benefit from. But then we realized people who had shopping carts also liked curb cuts, or people on in the fashion district like being able to roll their carts smoothly, or folks with kids could roll their strollers. So we're sort of thinking about this in terms of when you tap more into the sort of adaptations that you have made, it can really be a way of sort of reverse engineering universal design. Well, if I don't always like to be in front of the screen, I want materials that don't make me have to be in front of the screen. How does that help me think about accessible solutions for others?
One of my favorite universal design ideas, which one I never thought of, is stereo radios. you can turn, you can change your minivan or your car and have the radio just come out of like one speaker. Never really thought about that until I had kids, and they're all sleeping in the back. And I'm like, how can I still listen to something and not wake them up? And I was like, ooh, I think whenever we get in new situations, and this past year has been a new situation for everyone, right? Whenever we get in these new situations, we start to rethink the things that we've been using and wondering, am I really using them to the best of my, with everything they have? So in fact, let's launch that first poll question right now about video conferencing, because we're curious to know, what is it that you all use? Trevor, are you able? Yes. So for instance, if you are doing this video conference like we are now, let's talk about the chat feature. Do you all allow the chat feature? Do you enable live transcripts, which interestingly, I must have turned off because I'm not seeing them come up right now at the moment for this. Do you keep your camera on and off? And if you're the presenter, if you're the person in charge, do you require them to have it on and off, right? So we were kind of curious what thoughts you had about these types of tools and how you were using them. All right, so let's go. I'm just gonna take a look in the chat while we do there.
So I'm seeing some suggestions, Colleen, like speeding up or slowing down podcast episodes.
Yes.
I'm also seeing this magic thing about opening and closing multiple tabs at once. I love that as well.
Yeah. Oh, learning how to, oh, wait, someone knows how to enlarge the chat on Zoom. How do you enlarge the chat on Zoom? I need to know. I don't know that one. If someone wants to type that in, I think that would be super cool.
And is it enlarging the chat box, or is it actually enlarging the font size?
Oh, actually, now I'm clicking and I see there's something called Zoom. Again, all these things you never drag on the bottom right corner. Oh, yeah, I guess I could. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I think I always just left it the same way. So things like that. All right. So how about, can we see the results of this poll and see if people are, let's see what they, so great. Actually, I wanted to talk about the chat feature. So chat was big and live transcripts. Those were two of the things I think we were kind of most excited to talk about. We don't, not to tell you what to do, but to really talk about some of the things we've experienced. I think this was you, correct, Kristin? Like you wanted to take the lead a little bit on the.
Yeah. So I've thought a lot in the last year about what it means to be participating. And I was really moved by stories of folks for whom having the camera on is problematic, or for folks who don't have the ability to do a Zoom background. And then I've started to realize that there's this growing sense of scholarship around how being in front of your screen for so long, sort of needing to be performing all the time, right? Like, am I paying attention every moment? Do I look engaged and concerned? And we know that this is hitting now women worse than men are, perhaps because of the traditional stereotypical role of women as the nurturers, the ones who make people feel better. And so it's important, I think, to ask questions like, is what we're talking about something that needs the camera to be on? So if Colleen and I are in a conversation and she's showing me how she dices her vegetables, I need to have the camera on so that, I can see that. But there's a lot of conversations where we don't really need our attendees to have their cameras on, or where we could just treat this as a video conferencing software that's audio only. So sometimes when we think about disabilities, we think about vision, we think about alt text, we think about mobility concerns, but we can also think about ways in which we're engineering our spaces to require less pain points from our attendees. And for those of you who have not used live transcript, we have that feature turned on. It is coming to all Zoom accounts, including free accounts. You can click on it and you can see a real-time, pretty decent transcription of what we're saying. And if you don't like it, you can just click on it again to turn it off.
You know what? That was a great segue, Kristin.
Oh, I forgot this was the next slide.
Yeah. Let's talk about transcripts. Let's talk about this live transcription. I mean, if we want to be a little interactive, I don't know if people have the thumbs up, thumbs down option going right here, but the live transcripts, transcripts are something that really I've been working with for years, ever since I started my MOOC class, right? Like if you've taken a MOOC, you have those transcripts available to you. But I've seen that different people do it different ways, right? So sometimes it's the screen and then underneath it in a separate window is the text. We were just on a Google Meet and we noticed Google did it a little differently. We actually liked it better because it didn't come on top of other things, right? So there's all these different ways that transcripts can appear. And I think, originally it was, oh, great, now people who have, hearing barriers can follow along. And then I started realizing, thanks, and we've got a lot of students around the world right here. People are like, it's so much easier that they can, replay, like they can watch the transcripts while they're listening on the bus, right? Or even just anywhere. So there's this idea of, as an extra thing for people who normally have no issues hearing, but just prefer the transcripts. But now, again, in this whole Zoom university, the Zoom presentations, Kristin, you were the one who told me about this great tip with transcripts. Can you share it?
Yeah, so I talked to a library director in West Michigan who said that her team is working remotely and they meet over Google Meet, and not everybody has great bandwidth at home. And they've learned that turning on the transcript feature in Google Meet means that even if they don't have enough bandwidth to get the video, they are still getting the content more or less of what's being said. So thinking about accessibility for those with bandwidth concerns is a big issue globally.
So, here's an interesting question though. Someone I noticed in the chat just asked, like, can you turn the transcript on and off if you're on mobile? Because it took me a while to learn how to turn it off, just like when I was teaching. And it was really distracting for me because I'd see a typo and I'd want to like stop or things like that. So I do know that like on a laptop, you can click on the actual button that says live transcript and turn it on and off. But I will say, I'm there with you that doing things on mobile can be really tricky. I took a Coursera course on mobile and I'm like, oh, okay, I want to speed up what they're saying, and listen to it more quickly. And I realized on mobile that wasn't an option. And then I felt horrible because I know that in my classes, I tend to speak my mother disagrees, but I try to speak really slowly, thinking, oh, people can speed it up. But then I was like, oh, maybe they can't speed it up if they're on their phone. So, I think it's fascinating with, people talk about there's nothing new to learn or new to explore. I'm like, no, actually, there's so much fascinating things you can do. Go get off your laptop and go use your phone, or even better, go use somebody else's phone. So this live transcription can just, can help people with the low bandwidth. It gives people some sense of, autonomy and that they can turn it on and off. It's great that Zoom has now made it free, I believe, for all. It's available even on the free ones, right? So I think the biggest complaint that I've had and people have shared with me is like the distraction issues potentially with transcripts, right? Speaking of distractions,
can I say,
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Drop one thing I saw in the chat, which is, this is true for anybody who does interviews. So for scholars or journalists or others, Alyssa's pointing out, can you interview them with live transcript and the recording enabled? Then you can go back and make sure your quotes are accurate by checking the transcript against the video, because the transcript does have those timestamps. And that was really a game changer for my students that were doing qualitative interviews last year.
That's actually really interesting. And to be honest, it's probably good in that sometimes I say things in class and I don't remember saying them at all. And now students have proof. No, you said you gave us an extension or you promised us extra credit. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I did. Okay. For things like that. Let me see. Someone else kind of mentioned it along with that live transcript. You have that idea of things appearing though, right? Like, and possible distractions. And so we asked about the chat feature and a lot of you use chat. Chat seems, I remember department meetings just about this time last year, we're having our first Zoom meetings and everyone was just kind of listening to the dean, but mostly chatting. And then one of our colleagues pointed out, if you're using a screen reader, right, or some other assistive tech, every chat was being broadcast to them, right? And that was really disruptive for what they were trying to do. Or like myself, sometimes I just get really bad headaches, and I can't, it's really hard. So I would just turn off the chat, right? Like I like to encourage people, hey, if you really just want to listen and not read along, go ahead and just, put on headphones and listen. But I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel like if you're not following the chat, you don't know what's going on, and you kind of miss things. So one of the things that happened, I went to a great thing. If people are interested in accessibility, not necessarily on the technical side, but more about learning, like what you can do, there's a group that did something called Crip Camp over the summer, and they turned off the chat and they encouraged people to post conversational bits to the Twitter account, right? They used a hashtag and they did that. So I thought that was interesting. Have these kind of alternate and not competing ways to talk to people. There was a question, I'm just gonna go back for just a second, about turning the transcript on to burn more data. I'm not sure, but I do know, as Kristin mentioned, because if you turn the transcript on, you can actually turn the video off sometimes a little more easily and still get that. Let me go. I'm gonna just take a look at the questions. Something to think about, and feel free to this isn't a question, so if you want to put things into the chat. Again, chat is more for like, hey, we're just kind of scrolling a chat. The Q&A is for really specific questions. But I would love to know for people, do you feel like they should release the chat, right? Like today, when we're done, or in class, when we're done, and I post the videos, like personally, because I'm lazy, I don't release the chats. But Kristin, you do, right? But you have to go through a step. Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm doing sessions, there are just a ton of ideas that are flinging around that aren't going to be captured in another way. So then I, on request, will do the chat, but I always have to go through it and take out anybody's names. And also your private messages in a Zoom transcript may show up on the host side. And so I always have to do a quick check through that. So because that can take me about an hour, I don't do that unless it's requested.
Right. I mean,
they're saved for 180 days, but I don't.
Look at what we're just doing today. We have like a team of 5 people right here taking care of things like, chats and transcripts and doing things like that. And so, I just think it'd be really easy for us to do things the way we've always done it, right? And I think that's what we're talking about today is, we were in emergency mode and we got things done. What should I be thinking about? I don't want to redo the work, right? Please don't tell me I have to redo it again. But, what can I do to make it a little bit better? And I will say, I tend to do a lot of look at this or look at that. And just thinking about these things has tried to make me think more clearly about, look at this, and then I specify what I'm looking at, right? Or even in the chat, I tend to look at them. And when I'm in a class, in a learning environment, I repeat the question out loud and then go on. Because I do feel like more and more people are going to be doing things, asynchronously. They're not going to be live in class. And what I can do, if I can do small things, particularly to make them feel like they were in class, it's worth it. All right.
Yeah. The other thing I think that's interesting about chat is in a certain younger generation of our students, I'm seeing that students have different levels of comfort in how they choose to participate in class. So this gets back, there's been a Q&A about what percentage of the folks are disabled. And I think that that's a piece of the puzzle. But another thing that we're starting to realize is that some people have very strong preferences to participate one way or another. And that those preferences are rising to be almost as important as the disability, that in order to have an environment that feels welcoming. So you can make it a choice as an instructor of what you're going to do, or which are the sort of rules you're going to emphasize. But that's just something to keep to keep in mind. So Colleen, you talked a minute ago about narrating what you're doing. And we did have a question that came in earlier about, like, I'm a math teacher, how do I make things more accessible? And we know that there are math teachers who can answer that question better than we can, but we wanted to broaden that question to think about all the times that maybe we use annotation tools, or we are demonstrating something in real time, something that might not be accessible to someone who cannot see what's going on. And you might want to think about, sort of as an umbrella way of approaching that, the more talking you can do about what you are demonstrating. So I'm going to put 4, I'm going to add 5, and now that gives me 9. And then I'm going to take 9, and that's the side of this rectangle. And I'm going to, the more talking, that will get captured in the transcript. So that will be one way in which that you can resolve things. Or I'm going to open up my toolbar. I'm clicking here on the button that says X and moving forward. If you are in an academic setting where you do have visually impaired students, there will be resources in your district or in your campus to assist those folks in doing a much more sophisticated level of interpretation. But this will be enough to be of assistance for those who either don't have great eyesight, but is not formally diagnosed, or they've suddenly showed up in a meeting where you didn't realize someone was going to come who was vision impaired, and you don't have anybody on staff that can do that markup. And then Colleen, do you want to add about post-production?
Yeah, so one of the things, it was a great tip that I learned, because, teachers, no one likes it when you come to class and someone just reads off the slides, right? That's not really, woo, yay, that was worth getting up at 8:30 in the morning for. So, we're sad. We think we're being exciting by doing things live, and, and we're trying to spruce it up. But I got a great tip that if you are annotating anything in a presentation, and you're writing on the slide or something like that, post-production, when you're all done, when you post your videos, add another slide afterwards. Don't modify the first slide, make a duplicate of that slide, and then type in everything you wrote on, so that people with screen readers or other assistive tech can just see it. Or also sometimes I think it helps if somebody's listening and they can look at that completed slide while they listen again, for stuff like that. And there's just so there's a question in the chat right now, or the Q&A, that's about technical music theory diagrams. And so we're going to talk about visualization in just a second, but this is kind of what we're talking about, is if you're using something, and if someone were to read out your slide out loud, including any alt text and title, what are they missing? And these are the little things that we want to add along that line. See if I can figure out how to go this one. So let's take a look at the chat again for just a second, because we said we're going to do 3 main parts today. The first one was teleconferencing, right? Did someone get that? I noticed there was a question in there about turning the camera on and off. Oh, actually, let me go into some of the answered questions, just because I missed them when they become answered. What percentage of the population needs accessibility? So the last census count, it was 20%. Or 1 in 5 people have some sort of disability, and traditionally in visual, audio, or motor cognitive issues, right? So many times it's not just one, it's many, they have multiple types. So it's a huge, group of people. And so there's right now, it's a big time actually right now in accessibility and the legal requirements for it. So Domino's Pizza came out with an app. I don't remember when the app came out, but it made it to the Supreme Court 2 years ago because the app wasn't accessible for people with vision impairment. And when someone kept trying to order, they just told him, oh, just call up. You can't use the app, just call up and order. And the Supreme Court found that, no, that's illegal against the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? I think most people tend to hear about kind of the lawsuits coming from, a vision standpoint. And that's partly just because the Federation of the Blind is big, and so they can pool resources, right? But it's a very big chunk. It's the last check was 1 in 5. And there's also a lot of these are what we call the hidden invisibilities, or invisibilities, sorry, the hidden disabilities, things that you wouldn't know by seeing someone. So I have some, issues with vertigo and dizziness. And so, I mean, it's not something that you would think about unless you're a student in my class and you hand in a web page that has all these flashing lights. And I'm like, no, right? So I think a lot of these disabilities are a little bit more hidden along that one. So go along in there. And I'm gonna, was there anything else you wanted to touch on from the Q&A, Kristin?
I don't think so, except to emphasize this sort of broader question that I think we used to think of accessibility as like the blind person, the person who can't hear. And what we're starting to realize now is that we're starting to be more stronger about recognizing that it isn't just that tiny group of blind people. It might also be senior citizens. It might also be that need bigger type. It might also be beginning readers who need larger type. And so this is where that universal design idea comes, that we're trying to make life a little bit easier for a lot of people. And you know that if you've ever seen somebody who doesn't wear glasses and yet their font size is really big on their phone, you've seen that in action. So being more mindful, yes, about the specifics, but also more broadly. So the whole question of camera on and off, is that solving a disability problem? Not an observable disability, perhaps, but it may be solving a social anxiety concern, someone who's in hiding, who doesn't want people to see where they are for reasons of personal safety. There can be all kinds of reasons beyond the things that we can see. And Arlene mentions people with conditions like dyslexia. There's also quite a bit of talking about sitting in chairs all day.
Well, I mean, I just want to, and then we do have to go because you and I could talk about this forever.
Right.
But something that people don't talk about is what we call temporary disability. I talk a lot about how it's that people don't need to use a mouse in order to access your material. They don't need this and that. And people are like, oh, that's not me, until you break your arm, right? Until you're holding a bag of groceries and your keys and this and that. And then suddenly you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, in fact, someone just mentioned that. Thank you. They have a friend who broke both wrists, right? Or when I first moved to Michigan, one of my teachers broke her arm and her leg, right? And so guess who got to teach her classes? It's these little things that you don't always think about. But I think this is a good time to segue into document presentations, because we can talk about some of the things that we've done to try to make things a little more accessible. So we have another poll question, if we wanted to take that one for just a second. So when we're talking about event materials, we're talking about it can even be live or virtual, mostly virtual. But when you're making your PowerPoint presentations or your Google Doc handouts or your Google Slides, things like that, that would be an excellent, we're going to talk about that just a little bit now, and try to be cognizant of your time as well. Let's go ahead and see the results of that. And we know we won't be, okay. Wow, I am super proud of you. I am just like, I want to cry. I am so proud of all of you. Because I really battle this with my students, and I don't know if it's because of younger crowd, but I feel like the idea of like sexy, flashy, new tends to take precedence over accessible, right? And so let's think about what it means to be accessible. And I think a few years ago, it meant when you gave a presentation, if you had like paper copies to hand out, even if it was to share because your budget's a little low, you were pretty proud of yourself, right? And if you remembered to use a microphone, right? That side tip, always use a mic. Never ask, do I need to use a mic? Because then you're putting it on someone to say it is, right? But now it's more than that, right? Like now we're sharing digital materials. And so a lot of people think like, oh, then we're good. I don't need to worry about accessibility or screen readers because it's already built in. They have this written document. And that's just not really the case. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this because it sounds like people have been used headings a lot. I didn't. For years, I'd make my syllabus, and things that were important, I'd make them bold and 16 font, and then things that were less important, maybe 14 in bold, and then everything else 12. And then I learned about headings, and I was like, well, good job, Colleen. Look at you being making things accessible for other people. I was so, now as a teacher, I'm like, this is the way, because I do everything with headings on my assignments. And so I can actually, if you're in Google Docs, you can actually click on one of the options, and it lets you just click from heading to heading, and I can grade so much faster, right? And I learned how to use a screen reader this week. I finally made myself do it for this presentation. And I was like, wow, it is so much easier to make it through a web page if I jump from heading to heading. My other kind of quick tip was about links, right? So I'd love for you to go, not right now, because you're probably on mobile devices and I know we'll lose you to the internet. But if you go to your favorite site, take a look and see if a whole bunch of their links on their page just say read more, click me, read more. Or I went to the Library of Congress and it would list the day of the different notes, but not it was the time, what time, and then the day wasn't part of the link text. And again, if you think about how other people are using the internet, I learned that they can actually list all the links on a page to kind of really focus their attention. And it's not great when every link says click me or read more. It just isn't great. So along that line, what were we going to talk about next? I think along that line was the alt text. Oops, sorry.
Before you go on, I just want to say Colleen caught me. I had always used headings in making web content, but I had not yet thought about my Google Drive documents as web content. I was treating them like print documents. Yeah. So now when I have a document, I always hear Colleen's voice in my head reminding me.
And once you do it once, then it becomes, I think that's what I think a lot of us realize is this is just, you want it to become second nature and it's not that much harder. So alt text, for those of you who aren't aware, it's this idea that you can add text to any of your pictures, right? And so it serves two purposes. One purpose is if someone can't see the image, it'll tell them why the image is there. Some people think it should describe the image. I've learned it should really say why the image is there, right? If the image is meant to be inspirational, they might not understand it if you just describe what it is, right? The second reason as a developer is if the image doesn't load, it'll actually show up for people so you know which picture didn't load. And for people who have really slow bandwidth, right? I think we've got some people who mentioned that already. If you don't load the images, you still get why the image was there. One of the things that kind of tricks people up is this idea of, well, it's just decorative. I don't need alt text because it's just decorative. You do, and you can just put decorative. And I had a great example just today of why that's important. My kids don't have school today because they're doing testing, but they still have school. And so some of the teachers were maybe going to give homework and some weren't. And my daughter was super appreciative of the teacher who emailed no homework today, because then she knows, right? If you put in alt text that says decorative, it's you saying to them, I got you. You don't need to worry or wonder, we're in this together. Mm-hmm.
So I don't have expertise in technical music theory diagrams, but what I am learning is that many different groups that deal with visual representations of information are developing standards. So you might consult with your professional association for that. A question that often does come up is what happens when you have a data visualization? And so it's essentially an image, but it has a lot of text in it. And I think our temptation when we first start doing this is that we're going to write out every word and give every data point. And instead, you're going to say why it's there. What is the big deal here? So the big deal here is 10 years of data. Every time this conference is in Chicago, attendance is up. That's the big idea to communicate. You don't have to tell all the data points and all the locations and all of the years.
There's someone at our department who's doing music theory as well, Sheila, and I do know that people have been doing some really amazing things where they've been trying to do tactile as well. So if you were to be sent, for instance, printing this, if you can add information where if someone's going to print this on a very specialized printer, by the way, very specialized, it would actually potentially raise and lower like the amount of type. And I think that's really interesting with music, right? I think music and art and accessibility are so interesting because I think people love to go to tech, right? And let's do all ebooks. And I just saw the most amazing story about people who still do very large scale books with the raised textures. So people, particularly children, can really feel in the book, right? They can feel what someone looks like. They can feel things. And so I love that you are thinking about this for your music theory diagrams. And my number one recommendation would be to reach out to as many people as you can to give you feedback. The one thing is if you're in the position, like we're in a university position, I very strongly believe that we should be hiring more people who live this lived experience to be giving us feedback. And the key word is we should be hiring them, right? Like this is a special skill that they have. The ability of some people to listen to things sped up is amazing. So I think just bringing more people into the conversation and using, their expertise as much as we can along that line. Now, Kristin made this, beautiful diagram, and I just came in to be the downer and say, but if you're doing data visualization, tables are still good. They're not as pretty, they're not going to wow you with the venture capitalists and things like that. But there is something very accessible about tables. Now, this one did fail the accessibility checker, all right? And it's because there's no table heading on the top, but I saved that in there. Just, there should be something near the top that says, city and attendance or something like that. Side note, we didn't talk about this, but I can go forever. A lot of people like to do things like use color, like where like high numbers would maybe be green and low numbers would be red. And some of my students from, different countries, explain to me later, Americans have very much like a green is good, red is bad, idea of colors, and how in other countries that's not the case. So again, there's something nice about flat, old, boring tables along that line. All right.
And that then, question of color is really interesting because there's also a political concern. If you have red, it can also symbol one of our big political parties. So red and blue is a particularly bad combination unless you're talking about politics.
Right. And you know what? I don't know. Did we forget to mention, I think we did somehow, at least in the slides, color contrast. Color contrast.
No, it's coming up.
Oh, okay. Then never mind.
I think it's the next slide after this one.
Got it. Then even better. All right.
So along with our advice that maybe you don't need to be sitting at your desk to be participating in events, so we can keep our bodies moving during the pandemic. Also think about things like if people are going to be watching your slide deck on a mobile device, are your fonts big enough? Because that is going to be a big factor. It's going to do two things. First, it's going to make your slides have a more minimalist approach because sometimes you may just put less information on any given slide, but also it's going to make sure that it's readable in this format. And Colleen talked about color. So just as a moment about color, you do want to think about high color contrast as well. So these are actually screenshots from an early version of the slides. You can see that we tried this in 3 ways. One with the template background, one with a black background and white text, and one with a white background and black text. And doing these kinds of color experiences can be really helpful. And Claire's bringing up a great point about colorblind and having some colorblind checkers. And I will, when Colleen talks next, I'll look up a link to some of them.
Okay. Actually, just so you know, when we go through, there are checkers. So if you're checking on a web page, that's in my list at the end, right? And there's something called wave.webaim.org where you can put in any page. And then also in any of the Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, any of those, they have built-in accessibility checkers. Well, they will also let you know if your color contrast isn't high enough. I have not found anything in the Google Docs yet, right? I was trying to run things like run checkers on our Google Slides just now, and I had to convert it into a PowerPoint presentation. Because to be honest, I'm not going to recommend anything that only has 6 recommendations on the internet, right? So along that line. So you know what, I think, to be honest, we really, for our kind of last major topic, was the one we were going to touch on the very least, right? So let's, because we really are down to 5 minutes and I want to take a few more questions, although you all have been doing awesome job of doing the questions. And I just want to say, like, when you go to use your social media, right, you have, what were all the ones we were talking about? There was Snapchat and Discord and Facebook and Twitter. We want to talk about the fact that make sure you're actually going to your target audience, right? Like, I'm a mom, I'm on Facebook, right? You know, some of you may have noticed I got off Twitter because it was just getting too depressing. People are mean sometimes, right? But knowing who you could possibly, you know, who's your target audience, and ask around for who that is. Because it's putting all this accessibility work in doesn't help if you're not sending it to the right people. And I think the COVID vaccine rollout has been a really good example of this, right? Like tweeting out when the next, you know, thing is, when you can only be 85 or older to get the shot at that time. They weren't really getting the feedback, you know, and the response that they were hoping for. But then even then, once you get your audience, Kristin, you were just going to talk about how all these things still apply.
So for those of you who are in sort of low budget situations, they use tools like Canva to create flyers because they look so pretty and they're so free to make. Just be careful that when you then put those in your social media, on your Facebook page, for example, that you have one of the top or the bottom option. You either have descriptive alt text that repeats the key information in the flyer, or that you add additional text around the graphic that has the same information as the graphic. Also, for those of you who work in institutions and have a header where your phone number is part of a graphic, do keep in mind that means on mobile devices, nobody can just click on your phone number and call. So you may, that would be a suggestion, is to put your things like your address for maps and your phone number for making calls as general text and not as a graphic.
Yeah, it when people just take a picture and stick it out as the resource, that is one that always, you know, like, oh, one, I can't always make it bigger, it gets fuzzy. And two, when people put links inside things you can't click on, I'm like, yeah, sorry, I guess I won't be doing that one today for things like that. So this last, to be honest, we didn't get time to go over this accessibility training resources, but we weren't going to go into depth anyway. What I provided for all of you who might be interested was just some suggestions, and we've gotten some of those in the chat. So if you're doing presentations, Google Tools has very, very, very limited accessibility checking. If you convert things or you just use Word or Excel or PowerPoint, it's right there. It's called Tools and it's called Check Accessibility, and it'll tell you where you're missing alt text. It will tell you when you forgot to add a title to your slide. You really want to focus when you're doing your presentations on color contrast, headings, and the alt text. Okay. You can see I've included a website called wave.webaim.org, and that's, you can go to that site and put in your web page, type it in, and it'll check it for you. And it has a really nice color contrast checker where it not only tells you that it's wrong, but it has a little sliding bar where you can change the color and it'll tell you right as soon as you hit that spot where you're like, great. Because let me tell you, unless you're amazing, you and I can't look at it and be like, yeah, that's good contrast, right? There's math for that, right? There's another extension called the Axe browser extension from a company called DQ. And this extension is also free, but I will tell you their color gives too many errors. It says everything's an error, right? So I like to use the combination of both. So that's kind of like general everyday tools. If you're interested in like, no, I really want to embrace this, I wanted to include 2 checklists for you, right? The Vox checklist is more of a, hey, if you're a designer, do this. If you're the project manager, do that, like really working it through based on your role. While the WebAIM quick reference, this is a whole homework assignment, extra credit thing. It's like every possible thing you can do, right? And so using that helps. I have done classes at WebAIM. I've done 2-day tutorials there. They are not particularly coding, computer science based. I met a lot of people who were more administrators making the decisions. DQ has a lot of free webinars. And then Teach Access is newer, and they also do a lot of teaching. Finally, because I know some people are thinking about what can I do to get a job, right? We're getting some questions about training. You can, oops, I think I hit the wrong button. You can get certification from the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, but that does cost money. I did want to mention that, and I have not done the program myself, so I can't vouch for it in any way. I do just know that it's kind of like the standard of what we were talking about. Woo! I got it in. Trevor, I'm sure the people here, Emily was probably like, TikTok, Colleen. I know I probably talked really fast too, so I apologize, and we'll get those transcripts in.
All right, Kristin and Colleen, thank you so much for all of your insight. I know I definitely learned a ton and will utilize some of these tips and tricks that you shared. To our participants, thank you all for joining us today. You were listening, you were engaging with us in the chat, submitting your questions. That was amazing. Thank you so much. We hope that you'll join us for more MOVE events. You can check out upcoming MOVE topics and guests at online.umich.edu/MOVE. And if this topic was of interest to you, I'd encourage you to take part in some of the courses we have online. You can learn more from Colleen and Kristin in courses such as the Introduction to HTML5, Web Design for Everybody series, and the Public Library Management series. For the latest course offerings, events, and conversations, you can follow Michigan Online on our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day.